One of the cool things about namespace and DFS is that it is site aware. Now you may ask, well, Keith, what exactly does that mean, site aware? Well, let's use this scenario. Let's imagine we have 3 sites, the headquarters site, site 2, and site 3. And let's also imagine that we have 3 servers, one in each site, and they all have a share, and all of those shares, those 3 shares, are folder targets as part of namespace. And let's say the namespace is nuggetlab.com, DFS, root, and let's imagine we have a folder called DFS_X, and each of these shares are the targets for this namespace folder. Now, regarding site awareness, if the user Bob goes to that virtualized share of DFS_X, and he's in site 2, it would make sense for the referral that's given to Bob to go to the local share at site 2, as opposed to using a WAN link to go to some remote site. And that's exactly what happens by default. So Bob would be referred to this share at his local site. Mary would be referred to this share at her local site. And Lois would be referred to this share at site 3 because she is in site 3. So in preparation for this lab, for you and I did a little bit of work with the AD sites. And I set up 3 sites, and I set them up based on the IP addresses. And when setting up sites, we're setting up ranges of IP addresses or subnets and what sites they belong to. And so what I did was I took the IP address on server 2 and I associated exactly that address with site 2. I took the IP address 192.168.1.103 for server 3 and I associated that exactly with site 3. So instead of doing an entire subnet, I did a 32-bit host address so there's no mistake. And also, 3 devices on the same subnet could go ahead and appear to be in 3 different sites for the benefit of the lab. So everything begins with 192.168.1.something. And then for the client, because we have one client in this lab topology, I made 3 different IP addresses. I said that .120 is in HQ, and .122 is in site 2, and 123 is in site 3. And that way in the lab, what you can do is you can change the IP address on your client to .120, .122, or .123, reboot it, because there's a lot of caching that goes on, but reboot it, and when it comes up with the appropriate IP address, you can make a request to that namespace, and it will refer you to the location based on the site it believes you're coming from, whether it's HQ, Site 2, or Site 3. Also, in preparation for this lab, I created 3 new shares, one on server 2, one on server 3, and one on DCNUG. So that way, when we create the new folder in namespace, we don't also have to create from scratch the shares on each of the servers. I also placed a single file in each of those shares that indicates what server it's currently on. So in this lab, here's what we get to do. We'll set up a namespace folder. We'll set up our folder targets, but we will not turn on replication, because if we turn on replication and all these folders sync, regardless of which share Bob goes to, it'll look like the same content. So by not turning on replication for this demo, when Bob connects to the local share on server 2, he can see the file that indicates he's at server 2, or Mary on DCNUG, or Lois on server 3, based on their site that they're coming from. And in this lab, we'll do most of our work via remote administration right from the Windows client. So here on our Windows client, let's go ahead and launch Server Manager using the icon on the taskbar. And let's also open up PowerShell, the scripting environment, using the icon on the taskbar for that as well. We'll say yes to the user account control. And let's use the command nltest/ds get site, and we'll run that with an F8. So currently, this client with the nltest/ds get site command believes that it's in the HQ site. And that's because of the configuration I did regarding AD sites. And before we go any further, let me show you that as well. So from Server Manager, if we click on Tools, and from the drop-down, we select Active Directory Sites and Services. I renamed the default site to HQ, and I created 2 additional sites, Site 2 and Site 3. Also, under the subnet section, I identified several IP addresses. So when we put a mask of 32 on something, that means an exact match for the entire 32 bits. So I associated the .100 address with the HQ site. I associated the .102 address with Site 2, and the .103 address with Site 3. I also put in these 3 addresses, .120, .122, and .123, to be in the HQ, Site 2, and Site 3 sites, respectively. And that way, you can change the IP address of the client to one of those 3 and see the results. We also have some inter-site transports. And if we click on IP, we have one by default. It's a site link, and it has a cost of 100. And when I created the new sites, it asked me which site link I wanted to use, and I used the default IP site link, which has a default cost of 100. So if we look at the network properties for our Windows client where we're currently sitting, let's do that by right-clicking on the Windows icon, bottom left-hand corner, click on Network Connections, and then from here, let me bring this over a little bit. Let's right-click on Ethernet 1 and go to Properties. Now currently, when we did that nltest/ds-get-site, it said you're an HQ site. And that's because its IP address is currently set for .120. But if we change that, for example, let's change it to 123 and click on OK and click on OK again. And if we click on the 192.168.1.123 in the Active Directory sites and services and right-click on that and go to Properties, we can see that it's associated with Site 3. And then to verify that from the client, we'll click on Cancel. If we go back to our scripting environment and run this command again for nltest and press F8 to do that, now it says it's in Site 3. So after we set up a namespace folder, and then before connecting to it for the first time from this client, we can choose any one of those 3 sites based on the IP address, and it should refer us to the target folder on the local site, the same site that we're coming from. So if we leave this as Site 3, we should be directed to the share, the target folder, on Site 3. All right, let's minimize this, and we'll minimize Active Directory sites and services, and we'll minimize our network connection. And then from Server Manager, let's click on Tools, and click on DFS Management. So if we expand our namespaces information, we currently have one DFS folder, and it currently has replication for that folder regarding the targets, and that's what little green arrow on the top of that folder represents. And if we expand our replication section, here's our replication group doing that work. So if we click on Connections, currently we just have Server 2 and Server 3 replicating with each other. And so regarding the connections, we have Server 2 from Site 2, sending over to Server 3 in Site 3, and receiving from Site 2. It's a two-way street. And these sites are coming up as a result of the subnets I created, matching the host addresses of each of the servers and what sites they were associated with. So let's create a new folder. So we'll click on nuggetlab.com, DFS root, right-click, and then select New Folder from the menu. Let's call this one DFS_X. And then for folder targets, we'll click on Add. And as I mentioned, I've already created 3 shares on DCNUG, Server 2, and Server 3 respectively. So we'll type in DCNUG, click on Browse, and there's the share that we're going to use as a folder target, X on DCNUG. And in that folder, there's a single file that indicates it's on DCNUG. So that way, if we connect to the share on DCNUG, we can know exactly which server we're hitting. So we'll click on OK, and click on OK again, and then we'll click on Add, and we'll repeat that 2 more times, one for Server 2 and one for Server 3. All right, and with those 3 targets set up, we'll click on OK. Now, it's asking us if we want to do the replication group for that folder right now. And I'm going to say no, because it's more difficult to tell which server we're being spun off to if all the content in each of the folders is exactly the same. So we'll say no for now. And you'll notice we did not get the little green arrow as part of the icon here, which implies that we're not doing replication regarding that DFS folder. And so in the lab, if you want to go to each of the 3 servers, to DCNUG and Server 2 and Server 3, and right off the root, there's that shared folder with the X in it, and take a look at the contents. Each one has a unique file, one for DCNUG, one for Server 2, and yet a different one for Server 3. So if we bring up the integrated scripting environment again, depending on what site from a client perspective, we connect to that namespace and look at that folder, DFS_X. Based on the site we're in, it's going to control which site we go to. It's always going to do the local site if there is one for the referral. So currently, because of our IP address, the client believes it's in Site 3. So if we open up a new File Explorer window, we'll right-click on the File Explorer icon, click on File Explorer, and then up here in the path, let's go ahead and put the path of nuggetlab.com/DFS_root, press Enter. And then as we open up DFS_X, we're going to be directed to one of the 3 servers, and it should be Server 3, and so we should see a file indicating we're connected to Server 3. So let's go ahead and do that. And there we go, original on Server 3. Now, there is a bunch of caching going on. So if we change the address, to give it a really fair test, what we want to do is change the address, reboot the client, and then verify that we're being redirected again to the same site where the client is. In fact, let's do it. Let's go ahead and open up our network connection again. And let's right-click on Ethernet 1, go to Properties, and let's put this guy with an IP address of 122, which would put him into Site 2. So we'll click on OK with the 122 address. OK again. We get a message about network discovery being turned off. Great. And we'll go ahead and launch the nltest/dsGetSite one more time by putting our cursor at the end of that row and hitting F8. So even though it believes it's at site 2, the cached information is likely to go ahead and use the same information that it got on its previous query. So let's go ahead and reboot the client now that it thinks it's in site 2, and we'll test it again. So let's go ahead and close all of our windows. And let's do a reboot. So we'll click on the Windows icon, bottom left-hand corner, click on the power icon, and click on Restart. We'll log back in as administrator. We'll bring up a command prompt and do a quick test. So right-click on the Windows icon, go to command prompt, and let's do a nltest/dsGetSite. Press enter. That's great. So the client believes it's in site 2. So if it makes a request to that namespace resource, we should be directed to the resource in site 2. So to test that, let's click on File Explorer, and we'll put in the path of nuggetlab.com dfs_root, and then we'll click on dfsx, and lo and behold, there's the file on server 2. And regarding that referral to the local site, let's go ahead and bring up Server Manager again here on the client. We'll give that a moment to initialize. We'll click on Tools, and then from the drop down, let's click on DFS Management. So here in DFS Management, if we expand namespaces and we click on our dfs_root, and then we right click and go to Properties, you'll notice here we have a tab for referrals. So there's a cache, 300 seconds by default here, which is the amount of time that clients are going to cache the information from the namespace. And that's why the reboot is faster than waiting the 300 seconds if you want to test a different site as a client. And also it lists here that targets in a client site are listed first in a referral. And then if there's a target that's outside of our site, it'll then go ahead and use the lowest cost. And that lowest cost is based on the connections identified by the AD sites and services. So if we have 3 sites, we'll call them site 1, site 2, and site 3. And let's imagine we have a share here and a share here. And let's also imagine those 2 shares are part of a target regarding a namespace. The client in site 2 would always be directed to this share. The client in site 1 would always be directed to this share. So if we have a client in site 3 who goes for that same resource, they could go to the share on site 2 or the share in site 1 if the links are equal. So by default, the links are 100 for site links in AD sites and services. Or if we wanted to influence that, if we had a site cost of 50 between site 3 and site 2, we'd then have lowest cost. And if lowest cost was set for the ordering method for the referrals, then it's likely that the client in site 3 would be referred to the share in site 2 because of the lower cost between those 2 sites. So there's this cache, and there's also a cache associated with each of our folders. So if we go to DFSX, for example, and right-click and click on Properties for that folder, and click on Referrals here, we have an even longer cache on this specific folder of DFS_X. So the lab is available for you, my friend, to practice with this and have some fun. And just as a reminder, if you want to change that client site by changing its IP address, make sure you do a reboot of that client first. And that way the client won't be influenced by having any cached information from a previous resource request. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.